The neighborhood had always felt like a quiet, carefully curated world where routine ruled every corner. Perfectly trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes, slow-driving golf carts, and the soft sound of sprinklers marked every morning. It was the kind of place where the HOA took pride in symmetry, order, and strict enforcement of even the smallest of rules. For years, the homeowner had never questioned it. They kept their lawn neat, followed the guidelines, and maintained a peaceful distance from the drama that occasionally simmered between neighbors. It wasn't perfect, but it was predictable, until the day something strange appeared in the backyard. It started with a sense of being watched. The homeowner had brushed it off at first, blaming imagination and the stress of juggling work and home repairs. But the feeling didn't fade. It sharpened during early mornings when stepping outside to check plants, and it intensified late at night while taking the dog out. It felt as if unseen eyes were observing from somewhere just out of view. The sensation became unbearable after a week, prompting a closer look at the yard. During a routine walk along the property line, the homeowner finally spotted it. Perched high in an oak tree, nestled between branches and partially camouflaged with leaves, was a small, black device. The smooth surface and faint red glow gave away its purpose immediately. It was a camera, one with a direct sightline into the backyard, patio, and windows facing the rear of the house. The discovery froze the moment. A mix of disbelief and anger surged through the homeowner as they backed away, the reality sinking like a stone. Someone had installed a surveillance camera on their property, or at least aimed into it. A chilling realization formed. The camera was not positioned by a random stranger. It was secured in the oak tree that bordered HOA-maintained land. That tree wasn't in the homeowner's yard. It was on land under full control of the homeowners association. And there was only one person bold enough, controlling enough, to justify such an act. The HOA president. The president had always been known for extreme obsession with compliance. No flowerbed escaped scrutiny, no fence color went unnoticed, and no minor infraction was allowed to slide. Many neighbors whispered about his authoritarian tendencies, but most people avoided conflict by keeping their heads down. The homeowner had done the same. But discovering a hidden camera aimed directly at private space transformed simple annoyance into something else entirely. It felt like an invasion, an unforgivable breach masked by the rigid rules of the HOA. Panic set in as questions spiraled. How long had the camera been there? What exactly had it recorded? How many more cameras were hidden nearby? The homeowner spent the rest of the afternoon searching every inch of the yard. Every tree, every gutter, and even the corners behind the shed were inspected. The unsettling truth emerged: there wasn't just one camera. 2 additional devices were found. One tucked under a branch farther back and another mounted high on a utility pole disguised as a maintenance sensor. All 3 were positioned perfectly, creating overlapping views of the backyard. Outrage took over. The invasion of privacy wasn't just shocking, it was illegal. The homeowner documented everything, capturing pictures, angles, and timestamps. The evidence felt heavy in their hands, like the beginning of a fight they never asked for but were now determined to win. That night, they couldn't sleep. The thought of someone, possibly the HOA president himself, observing private moments made the entire house feel violated. Curtains were closed, lights were dimmed, and every creak in the walls felt amplified. By morning, the homeowner knew this wasn't something to ignore. This wasn't just an HOA nuisance or a petty rule infraction. It was a violation that demanded accountability. A plan began forming, a slow, deliberate strategy that would expose the truth. But before taking action, there was more to uncover. The homeowner needed to understand how deep the surveillance went, who else was involved, and what the president intended to do with the recordings. With the cameras photographed and their locations logged, the next step was clear. The homeowner would begin investigating the HOA itself, its budget, its leadership structure, its bylaws, and any loopholes hidden within its legal framework. There was a strange thrill in the unfolding mystery, overshadowed by the fear of how far the president might have gone. And yet, there was no turning back. Someone had crossed a line, and now the homeowner was prepared to push back harder than the HOA ever expected. As the sun set behind the rows of identical houses, the homeowner stood at the window, staring at the dark silhouette of the oak tree where the first camera was found. Determination replaced fear. The fight was just beginning, and soon the HOA, especially its president, would realize that spying on the wrong homeowner was their biggest mistake yet. The following days were consumed by investigation. The homeowner had learned a valuable lesson. In a neighborhood governed by a powerful HOA, curiosity could be a dangerous weapon, but also a powerful one. Each morning, the backyard was carefully observed, not for what was visible, but for what could be hidden. Binoculars scanned treetops, fences, and even neighboring roofs. Every corner of the property became a potential hiding place for cameras or other surveillance devices. What had started as shock had turned into methodical vigilance. The homeowner realized that knowledge, when wielded correctly, could be their greatest tool against the intrusion. The investigation revealed more than expected. Hidden within the HOA's community newsletter were subtle mentions of security upgrades and monitoring initiatives that had seemed harmless at first glance. The homeowner dug deeper into HOA documents, annual reports, and board meeting notes, tracing every line item that referenced surveillance, safety improvements, and monitoring equipment. It became clear that the cameras were not a one-off mistake or casual oversight. They were part of a pattern. Funds had been quietly allocated for installations on multiple properties, disguised under vague terms like community security enhancements. It wasn't only the homeowner being watched, it was everyone, selectively observed under the guise of neighborhood safety. While reviewing the HOA's budget and expense reports, the homeowner discovered invoices for camera equipment, installation fees, and even maintenance contracts that matched the devices they had found in their yard. Each document included the president's signature, approving expenditures without the board's formal knowledge. The meticulousness was alarming. This was no minor lapse of judgment. It was a premeditated effort by a single individual to monitor private lives, and the scale of it hinted at obsession. The homeowner's stomach churned with a mix of anger and disbelief. How could a figure of authority abuse power so brazenly, hiding surveillance under the guise of civic duty? Determined to confirm the scope of the intrusion, the homeowner began canvassing neighbors, cautiously framing questions about security upgrades and camera placements. Some neighbors admitted that they had noticed unusual devices on trees or rooftops but had dismissed them, trusting the HOA's explanations. Others were terrified to speak, fearing retaliation or fines. Yet, gradually, a picture emerged. Several households had been unknowingly surveilled, often for months or even years. The HOA president's obsession was not only invasive, it was systematic. With mounting evidence, the homeowner took precautions. Every digital footprint was secured, photographs, timestamps, invoices, and witness statements stored on external drives and cloud services outside HOA access. Security cameras, legally purchased for personal protection, were installed around the property to capture any further intrusions. Even simple activities, barbecues, backyard gatherings, gardening, became carefully documented to prevent manipulation or false claims. The homeowner had transformed from a cautious resident into a strategic investigator, determined to uncover every layer of the president's surveillance network. One late afternoon, as sunlight slanted across the backyard, the homeowner noticed subtle movements in the shadows of the HOA-maintained areas. The realization struck like a jolt: it wasn't just cameras. Occasionally, someone, perhaps an assistant or contracted worker, was adjusting angles or performing maintenance. The homeowner quietly took photographs, careful not to be seen, capturing proof that the president had orchestrated a network of live monitoring. The violation now felt tangible, almost personal. The fear that had gripped them during the first discovery had transformed into a controlled, steely resolve. As the pieces fell into place, a larger strategy began to form. The homeowner recognized that exposing the president would not be a simple confrontation. Legal action, media involvement, and community mobilization would be necessary to force accountability. But before any public move, the homeowner needed an airtight case, documentation, witnesses, undeniable evidence of deliberate misconduct. The web of surveillance was sprawling, but each discovery strengthened the homeowner's resolve. By the end of the week, a clear path had emerged. Investigate fully, document meticulously, and prepare for a confrontation that would expose the truth to the entire community. The president's confidence, built on secrecy and intimidation, was vulnerable. The homeowner knew it. And the silent, hidden cameras that once inspired fear now served as guides, pointing to a scandal ready to erupt. As night fell and the streetlights flickered on, the homeowner stood once more at the window, surveying the backyard. The oak tree that had first betrayed them loomed in the darkness, no longer just a symbol of intrusion but a marker of impending justice. The fight was escalating, and the HOA president had unknowingly started a chain of events that could dismantle everything he had built. The homeowner's plan took shape slowly but deliberately, beginning with a single step that would pull the first thread from the tightly woven fabric the HOA president had constructed. The focus shifted from individual anger to broader accountability. This was no longer a personal violation, it was a community-wide breach of trust. The homeowner understood the magnitude of the situation and recognized that the people who lived behind the manicured lawns and decorative wreaths deserved to know what had been happening without their knowledge. The first move was gathering irrefutable evidence, every camera angle, every invoice, every subtle line in the HOA financial statements that pointed toward the president's secretive surveillance network. The homeowner arranged the findings into a well-organized digital file, clearly labeled, time-stamped, and backed up in multiple places. The documentation told a chilling story: systematic spying funded with HOA dues, carried out without consent, and hidden beneath carefully worded financial entries. It became clear that the HOA president had operated with the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough to see the truth. Once the evidentiary foundation was secured, the homeowner turned their attention to the residents. It was necessary to approach the community without panic or sensationalism, but also without softening the severity of what was happening. A preliminary outreach was made by leaving anonymous notes in selected mailboxes. Notes that asked simple, thought-provoking questions. Had they noticed unusual equipment near their homes? Had the HOA ever informed them about recent surveillance upgrades? Had anyone asked for consent to record parts of their private property? The intention was not to alarm, but to awaken curiosity and suspicion. Within 2 days, small ripples began to appear. Residents walked the sidewalks with furrowed brows, pointing at utility poles and tree canopies. Some of them lingered near the HOA-maintained landscaped areas, examining branches as though searching for something hidden. The quiet confidence that once defined the neighborhood started to crack, replaced with unease. People whispered among themselves during morning jogs and evening dog walks. Even the HOA president, typically patrolling the neighborhood with self-assured vigilance, appeared agitated by the newfound attention residents were giving the surroundings. The homeowner's next step was more direct. An anonymous email from an untraceable account was sent to every resident, attaching photographs of the discovered cameras, copies of financial records showing questionable expenses, and summaries explaining what the surveillance system implied. The email was written calmly, factually, and thoroughly, outlining how privacy had been violated and money misused. The homeowner watched as the message quietly spread through the community, first slowly, then rapidly, like a spark catching dry leaves. By the end of the day, outrage had ignited. Residents, once complacent under the belief that strict rules equaled safety, now realized they had been watched, recorded, and manipulated. The neighborhood Facebook group filled with concerned posts, demanding answers, questioning leadership, and debating next steps. Some refused to believe the possibility at first, defending the president as a man of order and structure. But even their certainty wavered when screenshots of invoices and camera evidence began circulating among group chats. Trust had been fractured. The HOA president, sensing the rising tension, attempted to regain control. He sent a community-wide memorandum implying that the cameras were part of a temporary, security pilot program, stressing that no one was specifically targeted. But his words lacked the strength they once carried. Rather than calming the neighborhood, the memo only confirmed the suspicions. The residents wanted accountability, not excuses. The normally quiet cul-de-sacs buzzed with conversations, and for the first time in years, people were united, not by conformity, but by a shared sense of violation. The homeowner observed everything from a distance, careful not to expose their identity too soon. The community needed to speak openly without associating the scandal with a single individual. Only when the momentum reached its peak would revealing their involvement be meaningful. Until then, they continued to gather information, collect testimonies, and document every reaction. The homeowner understood that a collective uprising carried far more power than a lone complaint. That evening, as the sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood, a group of residents gathered informally at the neighborhood park, a rare sight. They exchanged concerns, shared stories of unsettling observations, and began discussing the need for an emergency meeting. Momentum was building, undeniable and unstoppable. For the first time, the people who once feared the HOA's iron grip were beginning to imagine a neighborhood free from surveillance and intimidation. The homeowner knew that the moment to step forward was approaching. The community was ready, the evidence was irrefutable, and the president's control was slipping. All that remained was one decisive move, a move that would push the scandal into the open and force accountability where it had long been absent. The pressure in the neighborhood grew by the hour, building into a tension that could be felt in the air like static before a storm. The HOA president, once the unshakable authority who monitored lawns and issued fines with unwavering confidence, now moved through the community with visible discomfort. His usual patrols became shorter, his posture tighter, his glances sharper. The neighborhood he once ruled with silent surveillance was slipping from his grasp, and he could sense it. The residents were no longer obedient followers, they had become wary observers. As residents debated the scandal openly, the board members, previously passive under the president's shadow, found themselves forced into discussion. They could no longer overlook the growing outcry. Rumors circulated that the board had held an emergency meeting without the president, a rare and telling shift. It was clear that the homeowner's anonymous evidence had pierced through long-standing complacency, pushing the entire structure of authority into instability. The homeowner knew this was the moment to act. The evidence was strong, the community was awake, and the board's loyalty was wavering. It was time to involve someone who could elevate the situation beyond internal HOA politics, someone who could turn suspicion into legal action. The homeowner compiled every scrap of documentation into a comprehensive report and delivered it to a private attorney specializing in property and homeowner rights. The attorney's response was immediate and serious. What had begun as a personal discovery had become a case with potential civil and criminal implications. Under legal guidance, the homeowner prepared the next phase, a formal complaint filed with local authorities, detailing unlawful surveillance, misuse of HOA funds, and violations of privacy laws. The attorney ensured that every document was structured precisely, backed by timestamps, photographic evidence, and financial trails. Once submitted, the complaint triggered an official investigation, sending a ripple of authority that spread far beyond the HOA's reach. The investigators arrived quietly at first, plain vehicles parked discreetly at the entrance of the neighborhood, officers walking the grounds under the guise of routine assessment. But their presence was unmistakable. Residents watched from windows, porches, and sidewalks as investigators examined the trees, poles, and entry points where cameras had been found. The officers took photographs of their own, recorded statements from concerned neighbors, and collected enough evidence to justify a deeper probe. Word of the investigation spread swiftly, causing panic within the HOA leadership. The president attempted to maintain control, summoning board members to emergency sessions and issuing defensive statements accusing an unnamed troublemaker of causing unnecessary chaos. But his efforts only amplified suspicion. The homeowners had grown tired of secrecy, and each attempt to redirect blame pushed them further away from his authority. As investigators expanded their search, they uncovered more cameras, some positioned to monitor sidewalks, others aimed toward driveways or community facilities. The findings confirmed what many had feared. The surveillance system was far larger than the homeowner initially discovered. It extended across multiple streets, affecting dozens of families. The community's outrage became undeniable, and it swelled into a unified demand for the president's removal. The board members, unable to defend their leader any longer, called for an urgent town hall meeting. It was announced via email, posted on bulletin boards, and even discussed in group chats long before it took place. Anticipation built as the day approached. Residents prepared statements, gathered personal grievances, and whispered with one another about how deeply the surveillance had shaken their sense of safety. The once calm neighborhood now buzzed with a collective determination to dismantle the president's power. The homeowner attended the meeting quietly, sitting among the crowd, observing the anxious faces and restless movements of their neighbors. The president sat at the front of the room, attempting to project confidence, but the tension in his clenched jaw betrayed him. The room filled to capacity, far more people than typically attended HOA gatherings. It was no longer about petty fines or landscaping debates. It was about reclaiming privacy, trust, and dignity. The meeting began with murmurs and uneasy glances. Residents demanded explanations, while the board attempted to moderate the storm that had erupted. As accusations and questions spilled over one another, the homeowner knew the time had come. Carefully, calmly, they stood, stepping toward the front with a sense of purpose stronger than fear. The evidence file was placed on the table, a thick, undeniable record of everything that had been uncovered. The room fell into a heavy, breathless silence. Copies were provided to the board and to the investigators present. Every page turned was another blow to the president's authority, another exposed lie, another moment of truth that could no longer be buried. The president's face drained of confidence. It was the moment the entire community had been building toward, the beginning of accountability. The silence in the room after the evidence was revealed felt unnatural, as though the entire neighborhood had momentarily forgotten how to breathe. The binder lay open on the table, its pages filled with photographs, financial statements, timestamps, and records that painted a picture too detailed to deny. Every resident, every board member, and even the investigators leaned forward, absorbing each unsettling piece of the truth. The HOA president, once the unchallenged authority of the community, sat rigid and pale, his power slipping away with every page turned. Then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted. The residents who once tolerated strict rules and rigid oversight began to voice years of bottled-up frustration. The atmosphere transformed from silent shock into a tidal wave of outrage. People stood up one after another, recounting strange incidents, unexplained HOA citations, suspicious maintenance visits, and moments when they had felt watched without understanding why. Each story added another crack to the collapsing foundation the president had built. The board members, shaken by the magnitude of the evidence, attempted to maintain composure, but their unease was clear. They exchanged tense glances, realizing the scandal was far beyond anything they had anticipated. Several of them whispered urgently to the investigators, pointing out signatures on invoices and referencing approvals they had never been consulted on. Slowly, the truth became undeniable, even to them. The president had acted alone, bypassing proper procedures and exploiting his position to create a surveillance network that violated the privacy of dozens of families. As the crowd grew louder, the investigators called for calm and announced that the investigation had officially moved into a criminal inquiry. They explained that the cameras were illegal, that the misuse of HOA funds was a prosecutable offense, and that each resident affected could file individual claims. The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. The neighborhood was no longer dealing with an internal HOA issue. It was dealing with a case that could involve criminal charges, civil penalties, and a complete restructuring of the association. The president reacted with a mix of denial and desperation. He stood abruptly, attempting to assert control, but his voice trembled as he faced a community no longer willing to obey him. His gestures were frantic, his arguments hollow. The more he tried to salvage his authority, the more the room rejected him. Every attempt at manipulation, every excuse about security or community protection, only fueled the anger of the people he had violated. Eventually, the investigators instructed him to sit down while they continued their questioning. The shift in power was unmistakable. For years, the president had surveilled, controlled, and intimidated others. Now, under the harsh lights of accountability, he found himself exposed and powerless. The homeowner watched the scene unfold with a steady resolve. This was the moment they had worked toward, the point where truth outweighed fear and the community began to reclaim its voice. Yet the homeowner did not feel victorious. There was still more to do. The cameras had been discovered, but the extent of their use, the footage collected, and the president's intentions remained unanswered. The homeowner provided the investigators with copies of all files and explained where each camera had been found. The officers took notes, asked questions, and prepared warrants for further evidence collection from the HOA office and the president's personal property. Outside the meeting hall, the neighborhood buzzed with energy. Groups of residents formed clusters on sidewalks and driveways, discussing the revelations in hushed but fervent voices. Some expressed fear at how deeply their privacy had been infiltrated. Others felt a rising sense of empowerment, relieved to finally confront an authority figure who had wielded control unchecked for too long. In the following days, the fallout intensified. Investigators arrived at the president's home with search warrants, collecting electronic devices, paperwork, and storage equipment. Neighbors watched from windows as officers carried out boxes filled with hard drives, documents, and files. Rumors swirled about what else had been found, possibly recordings, logs, or even plans for expanding the surveillance network farther into private spaces. Meanwhile, the board held an emergency vote and unanimously removed the president from his position. A temporary leadership committee was established, consisting of residents who had long advocated for transparency. The community began drafting proposals for new bylaws, stronger oversight, and protections against abuse of power. The neighborhood, once silent under strict rule, was now louder than ever, determined to rebuild with integrity rather than control. Yet, despite the progress, one unresolved question lingered in the homeowner's mind. What exactly had the president been doing with the footage? The cameras were not passive objects, they were part of a system with purpose and intent. And until that intent was fully revealed, the homeowner knew the story wasn't over. A sense of anticipation settled over the community as investigators began analyzing the seized evidence. The truth behind the recordings, the final piece of the puzzle, was about to surface. The president's removal felt strangely quiet, as though the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Lawn mowers hummed, sprinklers ticked, and children played in distant cul-de-sacs, but beneath the ordinary rhythms lingered an undercurrent of tension. Everyone knew the investigators were combing through the seized evidence. Everyone knew that the cameras had recorded something. And everyone waited for the final truth to emerge, the truth that would either bring closure or ignite a new wave of fear. The homeowner tried to occupy their mind with normal tasks, but the thought of what might be on those hard drives followed them from room to room. They had expected surveillance, perhaps recordings of people gardening or barbecuing, maybe even videos of mundane everyday life. But the unease came from the not knowing. The president's actions had been invasive, obsessive, and calculated. He had not gone to such lengths without a purpose, and that purpose remained hidden in the files investigators were now analyzing. When the call finally came, the homeowner wasn't surprised. Investigators requested a formal statement and informed them that the analysis of the data had reached a critical point. The homeowner arrived at the precinct with the same steady resolve they had carried throughout the ordeal, though their heartbeat felt heavier than before. They were escorted into a sparse meeting room where officers spread documents and images across the table before them. The truth was worse than expected. The footage was extensive, organized into meticulously labeled folders corresponding to specific homes, yards, and even timestamps of daily routines. It wasn't random, it was systematic. The president had been documenting the private lives of residents for months, possibly longer. The recordings included families sitting on their patios, homeowners working on home projects, and children playing in backyards. Scenes meant to be personal and unseen by the outside world. The president had watched it all. But there was more. The investigators had discovered detailed notes accompanying the footage. Observations, behavioral patterns, schedules, and even commentary on specific residents were written out in chilling precision. It became clear that the cameras were only one part of a larger obsession. The president had used the footage to profile the community, monitoring routines, tracking habits, and noting any perceived violations of HOA standards. It wasn't security. It wasn't safety. It was control in its most invasive form. The homeowner listened as the investigators explained how the president had expanded the surveillance network gradually, beginning with select properties and eventually stretching across multiple streets. Using HOA funds to hide his purchases, he had built a personal archive of the neighborhood's private lives. The officers emphasized that while no evidence suggested malicious distribution of the footage, the very act of collecting it was a severe breach of privacy and state law. Criminal charges were inevitable. As the information settled in, the homeowner felt a mixture of disgust, relief, and grim satisfaction. The truth was unsettling, but knowing it meant the final layer of the president's power had been stripped away. His intentions, once hidden behind polished speeches and rigid rules, now lay exposed in a series of cold, invasive recordings. He had built a world of surveillance, and it had become the foundation of his downfall. The news spread quickly. The investigators issued a public report summarizing their findings, and the neighborhood reacted with a collective shudder. Residents gathered in living rooms, front porches, and community spaces, reading the report and realizing how deeply their privacy had been violated. Some were horrified. Others were furious. But all of them were united in one sentiment: the old HOA had died the moment the cameras were installed. Under the guidance of the temporary committee, the community moved swiftly to rebuild. New bylaws were drafted that limited HOA authority, increased transparency, and required board decisions to be publicly documented. Surveillance of any kind was banned without unanimous homeowner approval. The neighborhood, once ruled by fear and rigid control, was being reshaped into a place governed by fairness and accountability. The homeowner watched these changes unfold with quiet pride. They had never intended to lead a revolution, but circumstances had forced them into a role they could not ignore. Their discovery, once a terrifying invasion, had become the catalyst for transformation. And the neighborhood, once submissive under the watchful eye of an obsessive leader, now stood stronger than ever. Months later, as the sun set behind the familiar oak tree where the first camera had been discovered, the homeowner stood in the now peaceful backyard. The branches swayed gently, unburdened by hidden devices. For the first time in a long while, the yard felt private again. Safe. Their own. The HOA president's cameras had stolen a sense of security, but exposing them had restored something far greater: trust, unity, and the belief that even the most powerful can be held accountable. The chapter had closed, not with fear, but with justice. And the neighborhood moved forward, watched only by the natural light of the sun and the quiet hum of a community finally free.